Plot and narrative are two of the most fundamental terms in literary criticism, especially when talking about fiction. So a lack of clarity about what they mean can be problematic. In conversation, we tend to use plot and narrative synonymously, right? Often alongside a third term, story, that seems to cover them both. Even so, we can catch ourselves making subtle distinctions between them. Hey, did you read that story by Poe? What a great plot. Yeah, I really liked the way it was narrated. see what just happened there, right? Story, plot, and narrative each designated something a little different. In fact, there's a long and distinguished tradition of thinking through these terms. Now, there are several other YouTube videos on this fine channel, including one by yours truly, that already cover in depth different types of narration as well as what we mean by plot. So I'm not going to go over any of that in any more detail here. Instead, I want to focus on the difference between plot and narrative and why it matters. To oversimplify slightly, if plot is the events as they actually happened, the narrative is the way those events are related or narrated in words or images. The modern scholarly version of this distinction comes from a group of early 20th century literary critics known as the Russian formalists. They called themselves formalists not because their writing style was overly formal, but because they were interested in thinking about literature in terms of its structural or formal features. The Russian formalists' name for the events as they actually happened was fabula, which we'll be calling plot for the purposes of this video. And their name for the way that plot is told or represented was sujet. And this is what we mean when we refer to the story's narration. Now, of course, the events represented in a fictional narration never really happened at all, right? They exist within the story world of the text itself. They exist, that is, only insofar as the reader can reconstruct them based on the narrative as it currently exists. But let me just add one more wrinkle here. According to Monica Fludernick, a narratologist, yes, there is such a thing, a specialist in the study of narrative, there are two levels of, or layers to every narrative. The level of the world represented in the story, and the level at which this representation takes place. This is the level of the narrative discourse, which is where we can distinguish between different narrative modes, right? First person, third person omniscient, third person limited. The former, again, would be the events of the story itself, the plot. And Fludernick's distinction allows us to see that we have no direct access to that lower level of what really happened, right? We can only access it by interpreting the narrative discourse with which we're presented. Our access to a given story's plot is always mediated by its narrative. Let's take a well-known example. Donna Tartt's The Secret History from 1992 is narrated in the first person by a young man named Richard Papin, who's attended an elite private college on a full scholarship. Richard's having trouble fitting in until he falls in with a small clique of students who take all the classes from a single charismatic professor. After which, all kinds of disturbing things begin to happen, resulting in several murders, their attempted cover-ups, and their long-term psychological effects on Richard and the others. But note, right, what I just told you about there was the novel's plot, right? The events of the story, and I'm keeping them suitably vague to avoid spoilers, in the chronological order in which they would have happened, were they real? But in fact, that's not the order in which Richard narrates those events, right? Instead, Tartt has Richard begin his narration at a point very far down this chain of events, so to speak. And only after we get this perspective, at that moment in time, does Richard then move his narration backward, closer, as it were, to the beginning of the events of the plot. And by the time the novel concludes, Richard's narration has actually taken us beyond the plot moment in time when it began. So the difference between plot and narration can be skillfully manipulated by authors to create all kinds of effects, including suspense, fatalism, paranoia, also sometimes effects of reassurance, right? As when you know from the start of a narration that the plot will resolve itself happily, even before we know anything else about it. It's possible to make a distinction between plot and narrative in just about any textual encounter, but there is one genre in particular that depends on this distinction, and that is the detective story. In its classic form, say by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle or Agatha Christie, typically when the narration opens, the main event of the plot a murder, a theft, what have you, has already happened, right? The body's already dead, lying in the library. The jewels are already disappeared from the vault. The goal of the detective is to solve the crime, and the narrative generally follows the detective as they do so. But in narratological terms, what that really means is that the goal of the detective is to reconstruct the plot, right? The events in the order in which they actually happened, before the detective was on the scene, so to speak, often before the narrative itself has even begun. And in this sense, the detective and the reader are aligned, right? We are both reading for clues that will help us recompose the plot via the mediation of the narrative. The difference is that the detective is doing so at the level of the events themselves, whereas the reader is doing so at the level of the representation of those events. Even more specifically, let's see how it works in one of Conan Doyle's best-known stories, The Adventure of the Speckled Band. In it, Holmes and Watson are called to a menacing country manor where they must investigate the mysterious death of a woman in her own bed. No signs of forced entrance, no immediately apparent cause of death, and a limited cast of suspects. The only real clue is the woman's final words, the Speckled Band. In other words, it's a classic locked room mystery. Right? Plot-wise, the main event, the murder of Julia Stoner, has already happened when the narrative begins. Actually, that's not quite true. I mean, this one is narrated, like many of Holmes' stories, all of them, I think, narrated by Watson looking back over case records from a distance of a number of years. So the narrative, right, the way Watson tells the story begins in the present, long after the case has been closed, then moves back into the past to tell the main story, beginning with the arrival of a new client, Julia's sister, Helen. Helen then explains, to the best of her ability, what has already happened, in particular, the mysterious circumstances of her sister's death. So we have a narrative within a narrative within a narrative, as it were. Right? But there's still only one plot, right? Only one correct order, both temporal and logical, in which the events leading up to Julia's death could have taken place. Of course, once Holmes and Watson take the case, they become part of that chain of events, part of the plot, right? That the reader must reconstruct from Watson's narrative, just as Holmes must reconstruct the true circumstances of Julia's death by beginning with what he can learn from Helen's narrative of her sister's demise. And without giving anything else away, let's just say that when plot and narrative finally align near the end of the story, the crime is solved. And a second murder, the murder of Helen herself, is thwarted simultaneously. The result is one of the most satisfying of all Sherlock Holmes' mysteries, and it couldn't have been done without Conan Doyle's ability to make use of the difference between plot and narrative. There are, of course, all kinds of other ways that authors make use of that distinction in genres other than the detective story. Right? Flashbacks, for example. And it's not just novelists. Also filmmakers have become very adept at manipulating, taking advantage of the difference between plot and narrative. Otherwise, now classic films like Pulp Fiction and Memento wouldn't have even been possible. So the next time you're leaving the movie theater and someone asks, what did you think of that story? Feel free to respond, do you mean it's plot or it's narrative? Or maybe don't respond that way, but think it yourself before answering, because the more thought you put into it, the more insightful your answer is bound to become.